Jacob Wolf was a good farmer, better than most in fact. In the early 1900s, he had a farm 3 miles north of Turtle Lake, North Dakota that was the envy of his neighbors. The Wolf family, like most within these isolated communities around the 1910s, were ethnically German, but specifically, they came from German settlements in Russia, Bessarabia, and around the Black Sea and Volga regions. Wolf was born to such a family of colonists in 1879 in Bergdorf, Bessarabia, what's now Kolosova, Moldova. This town was on the left bank of the river Dniester, which flows into the Black Sea. By the time Jacob was a young man, many of his compatriots were heeding America's call to settle in the West, where the Homestead Act promised them 160 acres in exchange for building a home and a productive farm. Rising anti-German sentiment within the Russian Empire, coupled with the prospect of free, untilled land in America, drew in throngs of men with similar motivations to Jacob Wolf. Men from productive farming families, religiously conservative men with a well-known Protestant work ethic. Jacob Wolf moved to America in 1903, where he met Beata Bossert, also a German immigrant from Bessarabia. By 1905, the two had been married and formed a vital link in the chain to the German farming community through his ties to the Bossert family, who moved with their daughter. The two had 6 children, all girls, beginning in 1907. On April 24, 1920, their neighbor, another German immigrant named John Kraft, noticed that a storm had just passed through, but their clothes were still hanging up outside the barn. An eerie silence hung over the property, and when he thought about it, he hadn't seen any activity from that place for a little while. Now, all of this land would have belonged to Henry Layer back in the day. It's at the intersection of those two roads I was just showing you. But if you continue down this road, then there is a ravine running right through here. And at the intersection with the road down there, if you turn right, you get to Jacob Wolf's land and the Joseph Mayer farm. These ravines run right from Jacob Wolf to Joseph Mayer's farm. Then you've also got another Jacob Wolf farm, but that one's just north of the shores of Lake Brecken. Kraft passed by their home to fetch his wife, and the two returned to the Wolf homestead. The first thing they noticed was a crying baby. That would be 9-month-old Emma Wolf. Before entering the home, they went around the back of the property. By this point in the day, most farmers would be tilling the fields or tending to their cattle, but none of this was happening. In the barn, they found the first of the victims of the Wolf family massacre. With a growing unease, the Kraft couple found the bodies of Jacob Wolf and his 2 daughters, Maria and Edna, ages 9 and 7. Thinking quickly, and knowing that the killer or killers may return, the Kraft couple swept the house and retrieved the infant daughter, Emma. One of the Krafts tried to make a call to the police using the Wolf family telephone, but realized their phone lines had been cut, so they hurried back to their rented farmland to the northwest, across from what's now Highway 41, leading north to Minot. Police were called as soon as the Krafts made it back to safety, and they found the rest of the Wolf family dead. In the barn, the bodies of Jacob Wolf and his 2 daughters were covered with a layer of dirt and straw, while in the cellar of the Wolf home they found Jacob's wife, Beata, age 35, and their daughters Bertha, Lydia, and Martha, ages 12, 5, and 3. Also found in the cellar was 13-year-old Jacob Hofer, a nephew of the Wolf patriarch who was basically raised by the family as their own son. All had been killed by shotgun blasts, apart from 3-year-old Martha, who was killed with the blunt end of the hatchet. Of the victims in the cellar, some showed signs of being finished off with this hatchet or shot again, although they were already dead. There was blood spatter on the walls. Authorities began to piece together more information. Some online sources claimed that Jacob Hofer was found in the kitchen, but this is a misunderstanding spread after retelling the story for about a century. He was actually found in the cellar, the first body you'd see upon walking in, facing up to the entrance. A single pool of blood, believed to be his, however, was found in the kitchen, leading many to assume that's where he died. It's pretty obvious. This is from the Fargo Forum Daily Republican. I found it in the archives. This was April 27th, 1920. This says, and I'm reading the quotes here, and the lower photograph is shown the interior of the kitchen of the Wolf home with the table at one side where the family had just eaten dinner. In the rear of the floor is seen the open trap door to the cellar through which the bodies of 5 victims were thrown. Blackened spots on the floor were made by the blood of the victims. victims. And the top photo has the subtext, and the upper picture is shown the residence and barn of the Jacob Wolf farm near Turtle Lake, North Dakota, where 8 persons were slain. The bodies of Wolf and 2 daughters were found in the shed attached to the barn, and a pool of blood about 20 feet in front of the door of the shed is the place that the farmer was shot down. The door of the residence shown in the picture opens into the kitchen, where 5 were slain. And as I search deeper, I see that the Friday, March 12, 2010 issue of the Grand Forks Herald has the same photo, but a wider angle and much more obviously visible what's happening. The subtext here says, "The farm 3 miles north of Turtle Lake, North Dakota in 1915, with Jacob and Beto Wolf and their first 4 children and an unidentified woman." If we zoom in, we can see that the barn behind the house has a more obviously visible shed attached to it, but in the further back distance, we can see the larger farm more removed from the property. I believe that the only thing left of this is the windmill, which is later mentioned in some more recent podcasts as the only structure standing from the murder site. According to investigators, it seemed as though a fight erupted at the home. A shotgun accidentally discharged, killing Beto Wolf and nephew Jacob. Young Jacob had a shot in the neck, while Beto was shot in the back. The killer, deciding in an instant he couldn't leave any witnesses, wiped the rest of the family out. This murderer grabbed a box of ammunition and shot Jacob Wolf from the window or door frame, realizing that he had started running from the home to get help or alert some of his neighbors. He had 1 shot fired from a long distance in his back. Another was fired at close range into the back of his head. The 2 daughters, Maria and Edna, were upstairs when the shooting began. Footprints show they opened the window and ran to the barn, where they were eventually tracked down and shot, the both of them in the back of the head at close range. Before killing the 2 daughters, however, the murderer first shot 12-year-old Bertha in the face. Lydia and Martha Wolf were the youngest victims, ages 5 and 3, who were unable to leave the house when the shooting started. The gunman, realizing Bertha was still breathing in the basement, finished her off with the blunt end of that axe. After searching for what must have been a good amount of time, the killer found the 2 daughters hiding in the barn and quickly dispatched them with the shotgun, then pulling the body of their father, Jacob Wolf, into the same building and covering all 3 with a thin layer of dirt and straw. He then walked through the Wolf family house, dragging the bodies of those he killed into the cellar, and left the scene of the massacre. 8 young lives were taken on that day. More info began to surface very quickly, and the community struggled to piece it all together. One of the first inconsistencies was found in the death of Jacob Hofer. There was only 1 pool of blood in the kitchen, belonging to him, presumably. So why were investigators saying that Beata and Hofer were killed in the kitchen? Blood splatter in the cellar also implied several of the victims may have been led there and killed in that cellar, rather than shot around the house and dragged there. Why then, if the investigators are to be believed that the killing was impulsive, were the phone lines cut? There was nobody left to call the police. Whatever the case was, they were given a funeral on April 28, 1920, an event attended by 2,500 people, dwarfing the small German town of Turtle Lake's low population of only 400. There were political machinations happening behind the curtain, and certain social problems being exacerbated by the murders that rocked the state to its very core, but more on the standing of the German community later. The mass grave here reads, Die Ermordet Family, the murdered family. Over the following days, investigators began to hone in on a neighbor of the Wolf family, another German from South Russia named Heinrich or Henry Leyer, whose property was just northeast. The rumor around town was that Henry Leyer passed by the caskets at the funeral and said he wanted them opened, a demand which supposedly upset onlookers. While there is no proof of this, it's important to know that viewing the bodies regardless of their state was a custom of Bessarabian Germans like the Wolfs, the Leyers, and the Boserts. On the map, if you're going north on Highway 41, you should make a right turn on 11th Street Northwest and continue a little bit down, maybe about a half a mile, until you turn right onto 16th Avenue Northwest, heading south again. Now, where 11th and 16th intersect, in that plot of land was the Henry Leyer farm. For the time being, authorities were eyeing Henry and following, if not encouraging, rumors of his involvement with the massacre. Regardless of who had killed them, the area was now being gripped by a panic that can't be overstated. The Germans here had just gotten through a period of brutal discrimination. Throughout World War I, many of them were targeted and ostracized, and in the case of the community of Christian pacifists, like the German Hutterites, even murdered over their opposition to being drafted for the war effort. Other farmers accused the Germans of supporting the Kaiser, and throughout the war years, the Germans, in spite of being culturally distant from Imperial Germany, remained in a state of self-isolation, often fearing reprisals against their own. Meanwhile, they were often falsely tied to a strange rise in left-wing politics gripping the high prairie. That's a more detailed subject worth discussing in the investigation. I will a little bit later. Suffice to say, the German farmers stuck to their own and were fiercely independent. When these murders happened, they immediately raised $10,000 for anyone who could bring to justice whoever was responsible. Investigators also noted the odd fact that the Wolf couple shared the same birthday, April 15th, and had decided to gift themselves a new drill press. When following this information, they found their homestead was the envy of the farming community, one of the most productive in the area, and filled with new equipment just like this drill press, potentially placing a target on their backs. Jacob Wolf was a little bit paranoid about all this new farming equipment, but it could have been a natural worry that his neighbors were a bit envious. In any case, on the day of the massacre, his wife was calling about picking this press up. The line cut out when she was mid-sentence, sometime around 10 a.m., if not 10 a.m. sharp. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots around that same time, but thought nothing of it. It was natural to hear them in a rural farm in North Dakota, something that could be brushed off as an everyday occurrence. But if the lines were cut at the same time the phone call cut out, doesn't this imply the murders were premeditated? Sure, you could say that the lines were cut after the accidental murder of Mrs. Wolf and the chore boy to prevent other children from reaching the line as the killer tracked through the house and killed them all. But Mrs. Wolf was on the phone when the line cut out. Why cut her off in the middle of her speaking if we're going to believe the investigators that this murder started out as a random accident that the killer followed through with so that there would be no witnesses left? As the days passed by, many local farmers were interrogated. Henry Layer was the subject of a very early suspicion. While he was at the funeral, investigators went to his property and asked his daughter some questions. After some grilling, she finally told them that there was a day sometime in the previous week that she couldn't account for her father in the early morning, but she also said she couldn't remember which day of the week that was. Police made a note of this and continued their snooping. Henry Layer himself was questioned on the 30th and had a pretty solid alibi. He began working at plowing his fields around 8 a.m. and continued until around noon. Locals reported hearing gunshots at around 10 a.m. but didn't think anything of it. Around this time, from 10 a.m. until 11, Henry said he saw a man standing in a field belonging to Jacob Wolf. It's unclear from my reading where he was implying this was in his initial interrogation on the 30th, but Jacob Wolf also owned a parcel of land a little further north. Henry Layer could have been implying he'd seen someone standing in this property, in this field, which is more visible from the Layer property than the site of the Wolf homestead itself, the place where the murders happened. Either way, there was about half a mile between the Layer farm and the Wolf farm, and because Henry didn't think anything was amiss, he didn't get a better look at who this man was. At around noon, Lair claimed he walked to his own barn and took a break, relaxing until around 3 p.m. and talking with his wife and neighbors. This was confirmed by his family and nearby farmers who said he continued plowing until around 7 p.m., stopping occasionally to make small talk with them. At no point did he venture out far from his property.
And if you keep following this road up, you hit Highway 41 heading north. The site of the murder is actually just down here, over the hill and past the ravines. Now, all of this land would have belonged to Henry Layer back in the day. It's the intersection of those two roads I was just showing you. But if you continue down this road, then there is a ravine running right through here. And at the intersection with the road down there, if you turn right, you get to Jacob Wolf's land and the Joseph Mayer farm. These ravines run right from Jacob Wolf to Joseph Mayer's farm. Then you've also got another Jacob Wolf farm, but that one's just north of the shores of Lake Brecken. And that was the ravine. Nowadays there's a gas line that runs right through here. And the previous video was just looking north towards the farm at the intersection of the two roads north of the Wolf farm.
it was quickly learned by the sheriff that Henry Lair and Jacob Wolf had gotten into a bit of an argument about 5 months earlier in November 1919. According to local rumor, Lair had been hounding the Wolves for compensation when one of their dogs attacked one of his cattle. According to Lair, however, these rumors were overstated because of the murder. He'd been friendly with the Wolves after their argument, and even neighbors confirmed their relationship was at the very least cordial. Henry even managed to sell the bitten cow for a normal price later and had no interest in starting bad blood with the family next door. However, the sheriff claimed he'd heard rumors that Henry was telling neighbors he suspected Jacob Wolf of sleeping with a neighbor's daughter. And very quickly, rumors like this began to sweep Henry Lair up in the narrative. The town painted the picture of a jealous farmer who tried to make a quick buck for himself after one of the wolf dogs attacked a cow and sat on the issue for months, stewing on it after being turned away by Jacob Wolf. As the months rolled by, Henry Lair began to defame Jacob, finally deciding to confront the family on April 22nd, a day that would end in tragedy. And when he finally did kill them all, he demanded to see their bodies to know they were truly dead. These were just suspicions being passed around Turtle Lake and Minot, but Lair heard them and felt he had to act in his own defense, even if it was a little underhanded. One of Lair's first acts that drew suspicion was his off-the-cuff suggestion to a deputy that they should search for clues in the chicken coop. This was the day following the first discovery of the crime scene, and the coop had been searched earlier that morning. When someone went to go search the hay again, right where Lair had suggested, they found 3 shotgun shells. At that point, the county sheriff felt fit to relay another story. According to him, he'd been at the house with the Bossert brothers, siblings of Jacob Wolf's wife, Beata. 9-month-old baby Emma was being cared for in an adjacent barn, and after a tense night in the wolf farm, Beata's brothers left in a car at 5 a.m. to get breakfast and check in on her. They left in a car with another man, leaving the sheriff alone in the house. According to the sheriff, he heard some suspicious sounds behind the home and caught Henry Lair walking near the barn. He called out to Lair, who stopped, but notably had his hand in his pocket, seemingly gripping something. After a tense conversation, the brothers returned, and Lair suggested they check out the barn. Henry Lair later told the police that one of Jacob Wolf's brother-in-laws said something that made him want to check the building, which he thought was empty at the time. When the 3 shells were found, he relaxed somewhat. The sheriff noted the odd interaction, but didn't take any actions based on it at the time. However, 2 weeks after the funeral for the Wolf family, on the 11th or 12th of May, Henry Lair was arrested. Papers reported he was somewhat of a loner, but not necessarily a recluse. He had a previous wife whom he'd divorced, and there were rumors about him feuding with the Wolves, voicing his concern about seeing the bodies at the funeral, and being generally an odd man or a bad man, rumors that were swirling around the community at the time. Atop all of this, an anti-German sentiment loomed over the town and the entire state, especially since the very recent end of the Great War. The state largely wanted this to be an internal affair, not a case of an outsider murdering Germans out of jealousy, but an easy-to-digest story of immigrant farmers killing other immigrant farmers. Henry Lair was placed under arrest and given a ride back to the police station in Washburn. On their way there, the car pulled over to pick up a supposed criminal, a man who was actually an undercover police officer. Lair and this undercover officer were placed in the same holding area where Henry claims he was unofficially questioned by this fake vagabond for hours, demanding to know more details about the murders. Obviously, Henry Lair saw right through this ruse and said nothing to the suspicious cellmate. Some hours later, police arrived with gruesome crime scene photos. They made Lair look at photos of dead little girls, a traumatizing demand today. Imagine how a German farmer would have felt seeing this over 100 years ago. They demanded to know how he killed them and why, and before long, the investigative team began to level actual threats. On top of this, Henry was easily manipulated, having immigrated not that long before and grown up in an isolated community that mostly policed itself. According to Henry, his written confession came under duress, the result of a beating and threats of murder and lynching. This began with a man, someone he believed to be the railroad detective, more on him later, striking him on the side of the head with a truncheon. He was then dragged across the floor by his hair and told that if he didn't confess to the crime, he would just be beaten to death. They then explained the situation to him in a very manipulative way. According to them, Henry could request a defense attorney, but that would result in him walking free until he was brought back in for questioning. Officers let him know that an angry mob was supposedly waiting for him outside, and the only way to not get lynched was to put him behind bars. They knew that he was very fearful of the anti-German feelings in the community and believed a lynching very likely, so they got him to waive his right to a lawyer immediately and sign a confession. Investigators supplied him with the story they'd already outlined so far and demanded he regurgitate it to them. After hours of beatings and manipulation, Henry Lair signed the confession, only so that he could stay safely behind bars. In it, he claimed that he waited 6 months to seek compensation for his cow being bitten. He claimed that he'd entered the wolf farm from the north, where he was invited in and got into an altercation with Jacob Wolf. Of course, this contradicts the previous statements he gave that he was plowing his field from 8 a.m. until noon. It also doesn't take into account the bad blood between Jacob Wolf and Henry Lair if the latter truly was spreading nasty rumors about who Jacob was sleeping with. Why would he be invited into the Wolf home if they were on such bad terms, if he's saying that this man is sleeping with the neighbor's daughter? Why did none of the neighbors see him walking to the Wolf farm if everybody was out plowing their fields at exactly the same time? In the written confession, Henry Lair claims that he entered at around 11:30 a.m., a full hour and a half after the neighbors said they heard gunshots, after the phone lines had been cut mid-call. Lair said that Jacob pulled out a shotgun, and in a moment of panic, Henry Lair reached out to grab it, but it discharged twice, killing the chore boy and Mrs. Wolf. This narrative is already problematic for more than one reason. As already mentioned, there was only one pool of blood in the kitchen, most likely one belonging to the chore boy, that nephew, Jacob. Also unusual about the police narrative, the one that Henry Lair was coerced into signing, is the contradictory statements in German papers. According to multiple differing sources, of the bodies in the cellar, nephew Jacob and daughter Bertha were both wearing work gloves, indicating that these killings could have actually begun outside of the house. If young Jacob and Bertha were killed outside in the preceding 2 days to them being discovered, their blood easily would have washed away, leaving only one pool in the kitchen. Coupled with the idea that the 2 girls were killed at close range in the barn behind the home, that the 2 children were killed while wearing work gloves, that Jacob Wolf was shot from a pretty long distance in the back on the front lawn, and that his wife was also shot squarely in the back, it's easy to believe that a number of killers arrived at the farm with the intention of wiping out the family, working from outside and pushing in. Another odd issue is the gun itself. In his statement, Henry Lair claimed that he grabbed the gun from Jacob Wolf's hands. However, Jacob didn't own that shotgun, and none of his neighbors could definitively say he'd ever been seen with it. Stranger still, Henry said he'd opened a random drawer and found bullets, an odd coincidence because he had no idea where the Wolf family kept their ammunition. It's very lucky for the investigators that a local auctioneer, E.N. Mayer, found the shotgun in a nearby pond. This weapon couldn't be traced to any local owner, and none of the neighbors had ever seen it before. By now, the cops had a story that they were running with, even though inconsistencies kept on piling up. To give a little credibility to Lair's possible involvement, German-language papers began to report that locals saw nephew Jacob and daughter Bertha in the fields around their farm at around this time, but not after 11:30 a.m., the same time that Henry claims, or was forced to claim, that he arrived from the north, and an hour and a half after those gunshots were heard. This still doesn't explain who cut the phone line 90 minutes earlier, or how Henry could have approached from the north without being seen. The sightings of Jacob Hofer and Bertha Wolf do seem to confirm the fact that they had work gloves on, something else reported by German papers. So at the end of the day, it is more likely that they were killed in the front yard while working, or that they walked into the house with their gloves on in the middle of a fight. If the sightings at 11:30 are believed, we should consider the 10 a.m. phone line cutting as a possible sign of premeditation. Lair would be absolutely shafted by the complex politics of the time. Authorities clearly took advantage of his fear of anti-German sentiment that was in North Dakota at the time, and he was known as a mostly unassuming loner, but not enough of a loner to be considered a recluse. He just kept to himself and his family whenever he could. Like Mrs. Wolf, Henry Lair had immigrated from Bessarabia with his family, traveling to the U.S. in 1886 with his parents. None of his background mattered to the investigators. They had their confession, and that's all they needed. In very short order, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. So sure of his innocence and trusting in the American judicial system was Henry Lair that he begged to speak with the judge after the trial. He felt that if he could just explain what had happened, how he had been coerced into confessing, he would just be allowed to go home. The judge obviously refused to hear him for weeks. It took until November 1920 for his lawyers to file a motion to change his plea to not guilty, but this motion was later denied. The prison doctor examined him, claiming he was perfectly healthy. This was a few weeks after the beating he supposedly took back at the police station. The prison barber had other words to say, telling everyone that Lair looked beat up and forced to make a confession. This was weeks after the police interrogation, the one that elicited that confession. As soon as he was behind bars, his wife Lydia, his second wife, divorced him. She sent the Lair kids to an orphanage that same year, and Henry Lair was in prison for about 5 years, but he passed away in March 1925 from complications he got during appendicitis surgery. He wasn't the only premature Lair to die. One of his children died in a tragic wagon accident, and his daughter Blanche had crippling anxiety for the rest of her life. Emma Wolfe, the only surviving member of the Wolfe family, was raised by her mother's sister Christina and her husband Emmanuel Hofer. For this couple, this was a happy relationship. Jacob Hofer, the nephew who'd been shot in the massacre, had already lost his father Bernard in 1917. Christina and Emmanuel Hofer had been raising the child between themselves and the Wolfes because Bernard was Emmanuel's brother. When Jacob died, they took in Emma. After a while, Emma Wolfe married and had several children, living to the old age of 84 and passing away in 2003. Her husband, Clarence W. Hansen, had an equally long life and was the child of immigrants from Norway. But now is the most complicated part of this story, the political intrigue. So you're aware that the state attorney general and the incumbent were both fighting for the governor's seat on the Republican ticket at the time of these murders. The governor, Frazier, was a man with political experience, a farmer elected in a landslide for a socialist faction of the Republican Party. His lack of action during these murders was seen as a weakness, and businessmen worked against his campaign. Now, I said Governor Lynn Frazier was a socialist. How can that be? Very few Americans know any North Dakotan history, but even less know that there was a more or less socialist coup in the 1920s. Once the NPL, or Nonpartisan League of Arthur Townley, was in place, big business resorted to any tactics they could to oust their politicians. One of them was to exploit this family murder, employing the age-old soft-on-crime propaganda that plagues every politician to this day. I'm hoping to do a much longer video in the future on left-wing Midwestern politics, but this should be a brief primer. Socialist thinking really began in the Dakotas before 1900 as an ideology imported by mainly Scandinavian immigrants, but as a viable political movement, it was spearheaded by Arthur Bassett. His day job was as a railroad engineer, but in his time off, he ran a socialist club at 4th Avenue North and Broadway North in Fargo, North Dakota. Bassett was the president, treasurer, and secretary of this club, and it was mostly modeled after the Christian temperance movement. I get the impression that Bassett just wanted a club for workers who didn't like the idea of hoity-toity dinner parties. Anyway, Arthur Lesor joined him and began recruiting Nordic immigrant farmers, doubling the membership in the early 1900s by merging the Socialist Club with the Scandinavian Club. In 1901, the Socialist Party of America formed in Chicago with much fanfare, and in 1902, Arthur Bassett and Arthur Lesor founded a semi-independent Socialist Party of North Dakota from the ranks of the Socialist Scandinavian Club they already had in Fargo. In 1904, the Socialist Club nominated Halvor Johnson on the SPA ticket, while the more well-known Bassett and Lesur were nominated for lesser positions. They all lost in a landslide. There were political machines that still hadn't been toppled in the state, but these early elections helped to establish names in the left-wing movement, riled up Scandinavians, and informed future decision-making and strategies. Gradually, Lesur and other SPA activists faded away, but Scandinavians continued to search for ways to get progressive candidates, even while the state's SPA chapter lied mostly dormant. By 1914, at the outset of World War I, which destroyed many socialist movements active at that time, a young man named Arthur Townley found himself getting involved. In time, he would come to lead North Dakota to a socialist government, basically a coup by vote. In that year, after Lesor had stepped out of state politics, Townley and his friends were canvassing. They attended a speech by Magnus Johnson, a Swedish-born immigrant and leader of the Minnesota branch of the American Society for Equity. Townley was captivated, and for Magnus's group, Farmers' Equity, took away the novel idea they called Third Power. This organizing meant running on a farmer labor platform, but instead of forming third parties, insisted on forming factions within state parties and switching them from the inside. What Townley realized that not many people in North Dakota grasped was that the state's political machine was already dead. Alexander McKenzie was the state chairman for the Republican National Committee for 21 years and had been elected sheriff 5 separate times. Although he had little political power on paper, folks called him the senator maker because he had the ability to simply choose from his personal friends, creating a list of nominees for the Republican Party every election. This had been going on since Mackenzie moved here in the 1870s, and although he'd been voted out of his official positions some years earlier, North Dakota remained essentially a one-party state. What most didn't realize was the fact that nobody was steering the Republican Party now, and all it would take to change that is to place someone behind the wheel. Nepotism led the Republicans to apathy in the primaries, basically trusting whatever candidate managed to appear on the ticket. Arthur Townley and his organization took advantage of this. Townley, who learned from the Swedish activists in the Equity Society, formed his own organization department. They firmly cemented their strategy and soon formed the Nonpartisan League with the goal in mind of placing someone behind the helm of a rogue Republican Party. In the election of 1917, the NPL got a governor and attorney general and formed their own sort of socialist guiding hand of the state through the Industrial Commission, a newly created governing body. John Hagen was the Commissioner of Agriculture and Labor, Lynn Fraser became the governor, and Lemke became Attorney General. Combined, all three of them formed a sort of socialist deep state within North Dakota. Fraser was the governor when the Wolf family murders were committed, and as a farmer by trade, wasn't really that concerned with it, especially when he considered that his base was mostly Scandinavian, not Germans from Russia, or Black Sea Germans. The SPA realized NPL strategy too late, and by 1920, both Arthur Townley's nonpartisans and the Socialist Party were fronting candidates on mainstream tickets, although Townley did it independently of any SPA order. By 1920, the Attorney General was William Lemke, close personal friends with Arthur Townley himself. What followed was a trend. Rather than usher in a socialist utopia, many of the candidates being voted in were only being voted on because they were friends with Townley, who became his own political boss. Some papers even called this trend Townleyism, a sort of left-wing populism. Around this time, 1920, more left-wing holdouts in the SPA were upset at Townley seizing the reins of power from them. They had previously ordered the SPA mayor of Minot, Arthur LeSueur, a pioneer of socialism in the Midwest, to resign from his post. He did so, and his star quickly faded away. Townley refused to retire in that same way, and was kicked out of the party entirely for it. As you can probably guess, many of the candidates elected since 1916 had grown a little bit disillusioned with the dictatorial leadership of Arthur Townley. By the time of the Wolf family massacre, the governor was Lynn Fraser and the Attorney General, Wild Bill William Langer. Although elected Attorney General in 1916, Langer's clashes with Townley and the rest of the NPL drove a wedge between them, at least for the time being. There were cultural differences too. Langer was the child of German immigrants and could speak their language fluently, something that did him big favors in the community of Turtle Lake, even though most of the supporters on the NPL came from Nordic places. He was also one of the few professional men on the NPL ticket in 1916, and by that I mean professional politicians, while most others, like his competition, Governor Fraser, were simple farmers. By the time of the massacre, Langer was publicly accusing Townley and Fraser of Bolshevism and of turning North Dakota communists. His goal was to get Langer voted out the next election. You can see how these murders would fracture the NPL. Several days had passed since the killings at Turtle Lake, and Lynn Fraser wasn't really acting about it. Nobody thought he was very concerned at all. As a proud member of the German community, and as someone already accusing Fraser and the rest of the Nonpartisan League of being a sort of cult around Townley, Bill Langer, Wild Bill, used all resources he had at his disposal to investigate. The murders were in late April, and the gubernatorial elections were to be held in November of that same year, so Attorney General or State Attorney General Langer made it his business to discredit the Republican NPL of Townley and Fraser. Wild Bill Langer sent his own investigators and even visited the crime scene as soon as he could possibly make the trip. Accompanying him was the chief of police from Bismarck, a private eye from the Field Protective Agency of St. Paul, and a Northern Pacific Railway police investigator. When Lynn Fraser was refusing to use state funds to look into the murders, Langer put up his own money to do so, making state leaders look very bad in the process. His strategy seems to have worked, at least in the long run. Perhaps they used dirty tactics, roughing up Henry Lair until he admitted to the crime, but in their defense, they probably believed he was the most likely culprit. State Attorney General Wild Bill became a household name, and although his nemesis, Lynn Fraser, won the 1920 gubernatorial race with 51% of the vote, the following year would see the first recall election of a governor in American history. All three members of that industrial commission would be removed from office. Governor Fraser, Lemke, who was elected State Attorney General shortly after the murders, and Agriculture Commissioner John Hagen. As a household name, Wild Bill ran for and was eventually elected 17th state governor from 1932 to 34, and again in 37, becoming the 21st governor of North Dakota. As an interesting aside, Langer briefly became the dictator of the state in a very tongue-in-cheek way. He was convicted, along with 5 others, of conspiracy to defraud the federal government in a widely overblown show trial. The basic gist of this scandal is that he required state employees to donate a small fraction of their salary to the state's weekly newspaper and to the NPL office. At that point, he'd mended relationships with the league. This was a common practice, accepted and not illegal on the state level. However, because some highway workers were being paid with federal relief money, charges were brought that they were defrauding Uncle Sam. Because of the resulting felony conviction, the state Supreme Court declared him an illegitimate governor and demanded he be replaced by then Lieutenant Governor Ole Olson. Enraged at the bureaucracy used to convict him of conspiracy, Wild Bill lived true to his name, barricading himself in the governor's mansion, signing the Declaration of Independence of North Dakota, and declaring martial law on Bismarck. Of course, he backed down as his own officers refused to carry out these outlandish orders, and his first term was finished by someone else. He was, if nothing else, a master of political theater. No Republican has ever been convicted of felony charges since. The end.